So, was João Pedro right in what he said about Brighton Hove Albion? Welcome to Seagulls Central. My name is Adam MacDonald and welcome back to my YouTube channel. As I always say, if you're a first-time watcher of this channel, thank you very much for clicking on this video, and welcome back if you are part of the Seagulls Central subscriber group, the fastest growing fan community out there on YouTube, on social media, amongst the Brighton Hove Albion fan community. Thank you very much for coming back. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, and you'll be first and fastest to all the best, quickest Brighton Hove Albion news as the season goes on. So thank you very much for coming to this video. And I'm going to get stuck into today some of the quotes that we've heard in the last kind of few days, last week or so, around obviously João Pedro, ex-Brighton striker, ex-Brighton number 10 attacker, who obviously we lost this summer. £55 million transfer to Chelsea 2 years after we signed him from Watford for, at the time, a club record fee of £30 million. And let's just make no bones about it, an absolutely brilliant player, a complete, prodigious talent, one of the best young talents in the Premier League in terms of when we signed him, what we saw from him. A massively, massively important player for the Albion over the last kind of 2 seasons or so. You think about the European campaign that he was a part of, and what he did for us last season as well, the way that he was able to take games by the scruff of the neck. And you can just tell by the quality he has, he is destined for the top. Obviously, he's gone to Chelsea now, and he's spoken a little bit about kind of his move to Chelsea, bedding in at Chelsea, but also Brighton got a little nod. And I think has rattled a few feathers, ruffled a few feathers among some Brighton fans, particularly on social media. I think we're seeing some conversations around Brighton fans kind of wondering whether he was a little bit arrogant in these comments, whether he was right to say what he said. And I want to just open up the conversation around where Brighton go after João Pedro, kind of whether he was right to say what he said, and what maybe his comments speak to, if they are true or if they are false. So let me get into what the comments exactly were. So these were the quotes. This was João Pedro talking to a journalist called Dominic Smith from the Evening Standard. Obviously the Evening Standard, huge on Chelsea news, all the London clubs. And this was him speaking directly to Dominic Smith. He's talking about Cole Palmer, João Pedro was here, and he says, "Cole's a superstar. When I came to Chelsea, I was a little bit scared about how he was going to react because I was the main guy at Brighton. I knew Chelsea would be different. I said, Cole, I'm here to help you, don't worry." So that was the quote, and in itself it's pretty innocuous. It feels like a bit of a nothing comment, but I think it's that statement in the middle. Because I was the main guy at Brighton. And loads of people have said, yeah, you wish, mate, like you weren't the main guy. You think you're bigger than the club. Actually, we had your Dunks, we had Mitomas, you had Van Hecke, we had Belabor. How can you say you were the main guy? And I suppose, I don't know, is he right to say that? I think clearly for a long period of time at Brighton, João Pedro was our main guy. And yes, you could say someone like Lewis Dunk has always been the main guy. For as long as he's been at the club, for as long as he's been captain, he's the guy who's taken us from Championship football to Premier League European positions, and he stayed, at the forefront of our defence throughout the whole time. Jan-Paul Van Hecke, a player of the season last season. Pascal Gross in the past, a brilliant player. Mitoma, the player that clearly the club want to hang on to most of all the players that, we have in our attack. Players like Danny Welbeck, players like Belabor. I suppose the thing about the Brighton model is that you can't always have just kind of one main guy, and I think if you ever were to be in a position where you did just have one main guy, the second you sell him, things become very difficult. But I do see, to be fair to him, what João Pedro is saying here. And it's one of those phrases I've spoken about loads of times before around João Pedro, which is that talismanic way that he had about him. All you got to do is think back to those European nights, particularly the Amex. Think about that penalty away in Marseille. Clutch moments where the pressure was on, we needed to score in big games. He was a huge big game player when it came to scoring goals, when it came to changing games. He had to play as a 9 at times. He played as a 10. And I think ultimately, when you're talking about main guys, you are generally in this context, I think he's obviously referring to the fact that he was the player who was relied upon to score goals. He was the player who, was probably one of the first names of the team sheet. He was literally wearing the number 9 for the Albion. So it's kind of understandable why that assertion might be made from him. And I think it's interesting when you look into some of the comments that kind of people have made around this, things like this. I always felt like Mitoma was the main guy instead. So glad we got rid of him. That sums him up perfectly. It's not about him. should be about the team. He always thought it was about him. There are a few more here as well. There was, boring. Bro was injured 70% of the season. No eye in team. He's wrong. All of these kind of things. I pray we beat Chelsea when we next play them. Loved him, but if he really was the main guy, we would have done absolutely everything to keep him and not sell him. Look, I think there's times where you need players like that in your side, where you need players who have that absolute supreme confidence, have that, arrogance in the way they play, having the ability to step up in the big moments. I think we were certainly grateful for that. And you think about the big games, you think about Man United, the goals he scored in big games against Man United, particularly in those European games and the way he made an impact in those games. So I think he is right, in my opinion, to say that. Does it speak to maybe his character, his personality, his confidence, his arrogance, his maybe sense that he was entitled to play for a big team? Maybe, yeah. And, there have been some quotes, I think maybe it's part of that same interview where he kind of said, ultimately I turned down the Newcastle move because I wanted to get back to London, doing 2 years in Brighton, it made me want to get back to London. Speaking about, the implication was that he found it really difficult to get up to London. Obviously, kind of understand that. I suppose if he came to Watford as a youngster and, enjoyed, going out in London, maybe that move to Chelsea would be more, appealing than someone like Newcastle. But to be honest, all we've seen so far from this season is that he's absolutely taken this opportunity, taken his chance at Chelsea, and is likely to become one of the main men at Chelsea. I think many of us had predicted it, that actually 55 million quid for him will look really, really, cheap in a couple of years' time when he is likely to be one of the best attackers in the Premier League. For someone who was such a main guy there, for Brighton at least, if we focus on the Albion and how we can best replace him, what kind of hole does it leave for the Albion? And let's talk a little bit around kind of what he brought and maybe what Brighton need in the kind of replacement of that. I think in terms of becoming that main guy and becoming a player who can score big goals in big games, who can come up clutch when we need him, I do think, Jorginho Rutter is an excellent kind of replacement. I think the club clearly view him as the short-term João Pedro replacement, that in terms of this season, he's a player who can step up. He's got that same ability to play off a striker, play with a striker, play obviously as a number 9 himself. He's got fantastic dribbling abilities. He can create goals. He can score goals. He can take penalties. He can take free kicks. But he also, in kind of big moments, steps up. We've seen him score in his own right so many big goals for Brighton. And even this season, he's been involved in massive moments. You think about the comeback against Man City only last weekend, where he played such an important role himself in that. So I think that's obviously in one sense way that we're able to replace João Pedro. I think literally in terms of style. But I do think maybe there is a little bit of a gap in the team at the moment in terms of Brighton replacing those goals, replacing the surefire starting lineup when it comes to the attack. I think that number 9, number 10 position absolutely is still up for grabs. Welbeck hasn't exactly started the season brilliantly. Rutter, a very good player and has started pretty well, but obviously had a little injury, only came on against Man City. We've seen him play as a 9. Is he really a 10? We've seen Matt O'Reilly play there. Seamas looks like he will likely be involved in some capacity, at least off the bench, you'd expect, against Bournemouth. And I think Brighton do need to try and freshen up that number 9 position a little bit, or we need to kind of quickly see Danny Welbeck kind of get back to his best. I think, a front two of Danny Welbeck and Jorginho Rutter, absolutely for me, when they're both at their best, when we had peak Danny Welbeck last season linking up with Jorginho Rutter, is absolutely an adequate replacement for someone like João Pedro. But I think in the long term, I think even over the course of a season, Brighton do need to have more options. And I think what we probably will see is Brighton relying on Jorginho Rutter a little bit more as a kind of out and out number 9, which ideally I think maybe we wouldn't do. I think in the long term, maybe Rutter playing off someone like Seamas does feel like a nice kind of, counterbalance in terms of styles, in terms of positions, in terms of ways of playing. I feel like those two would link up quite nicely. And I think maybe Seamas in that kind of Evan Ferguson. One thing you will say though, actually, is that Evan Ferguson, who I think is quite similar to the Seamas position, And João Pedro, who I think is quite similar to the obviously Rutter position, never massively linked up well when they were playing together. Ferguson and João Pedro. We never really saw the best of both of them when Ferguson was a 9 and a João Pedro was a 10. And obviously they're different players in their own right. But I think if you think in terms of style as well, I wonder whether that Seamas and Rutter combination will be one that we see a lot this season and will be one that works. I think it's interesting. I do think over these next few months we're going to see how light or how strong and kind of how well equipped we are to replace the goals that we've lost through João Pedro. I think the first 3-4 games of the season, Brighton have looked a little bit less sharp up front, a little bit less like there's a clear and obvious option in terms of a talismanic striker. And I think certainly with Jorginho Rutter getting injured, that's kind of emphasised that even more. But I think Rutter will be that. Let me know. I'd love to know what you think. Do you think, the extent to which João Pedro was, quote unquote, the main guy, has been overblown? Is that him being arrogant? Do you agree with many of the comments that we've seen from Brighton fans where it's completely shutting it down? Or actually, do you think he has a point? And certainly those kind of strikers, the players in those positions scoring big goals, kind of do maybe deserve the title of kind of being the main guy. And, it's good to have attacking players with confidence who understand how important they are to the team and therefore can come up in big moments. Let me know in the comments. I would love to know your thoughts. As always, if you've got this far in the video, if you enjoyed it and you haven't already subscribed to the channel, please hit that subscribe button, turn your notifications on, and get in the comments. Let me know, is João Pedro right about what he said about his time at Brighton? Thank you very much for watching. I will see you on the next one. And as always, up the Albion.